They didn't announce it at an air show. There were no champagne bottles, no global CEOs on stage, no countdowns streamed across the world. Instead, the reveal happened quietly, inside a secured hangar, under harsh industrial lights, far from the cameras that usually define aviation milestones. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because for the first time, an aircraft rolled into view carrying a label the aviation world was never taught to expect, designed and built in Africa. Specifically, Burkina Faso. For decades, African skies have been filled with aircraft designed elsewhere, financed elsewhere, maintained under foreign contracts, and governed by external supply chains. Africa flew, but it never truly owned the means of flight. Until now. The aircraft itself doesn't scream spectacle. No extravagant paint. No exaggerated angles meant to impress headlines. Its design is purposeful, functional, built around necessity rather than prestige. And that alone signals something important. This wasn't built to impress the world. It was built to work. Engineers involved in the project describe a development process shaped by constraints most aerospace programs never face. Limited access to global supply chains. Sanctions-era logistics. Inconsistent infrastructure. Budget ceilings that force precision rather than excess. In other words, conditions that punish inefficiency. And yet, under those conditions, an aircraft emerged. Not a mock-up, not a concept shell, but a functioning platform, assembled, tested, and prepared on African soil. That fact alone challenges a deeply embedded assumption that advanced aerospace manufacturing is impossible without legacy institutions, trillion-dollar ecosystems, or decades of inherited infrastructure. Burkina Faso didn't wait for permission. It adapted. The aircraft's architecture reflects that mindset. Modular systems designed for local maintenance. Components chosen for resilience rather than luxury. A structure optimized for environments where repairability matters as much as performance. This isn't aviation built for glossy brochures. It's aviation built for reality. And that's why the implications extend far beyond a single airframe. Because once a country proves it can design, assemble, and test an aircraft independently, the question stops being, can it fly? The question becomes, what else no longer requires external approval? Early observers noted something else, something subtle but telling. The project wasn't framed as a one-off achievement. Internal documents reportedly referenced scalability, training pipelines, and localized supply development. This wasn't a headline. It was a foundation. That's when regional analysts began paying attention. Not because of national pride, but because of strategic math. Aerospace capability isn't just about transportation. It's about surveillance, logistics, disaster response, border control, and technological sovereignty. Countries that build aircraft don't just move people. They move leverage. And leverage, once established, changes negotiations silently. What makes this moment even more unexpected is who wasn't involved. No major Western aerospace firm took credit. No foreign government stood at the center of the announcement. Technical collaboration existed, but ownership did not leave the continent. That distinction matters. Because Africa has long been the testing ground for imported solutions. This time, the solution originated locally, and only then engaged outward. As word began to circulate beyond Burkina Faso's borders, reactions followed a familiar pattern. First, disbelief. Then, minimization. Then, quiet verification. Engineers asked for specs. Analysts asked for timelines. Competitors asked different questions about cost, adaptability, and intent. And in the background of all of it, a larger realization began to take shape. If Burkina Faso can do this, under these conditions, then the global map of innovation may be far more outdated than anyone wants to admit. Behind the hangar doors, the conversation shifted from what was built to what comes next. Because aircraft are never just machines. They are systems, economic, educational, industrial. To keep one flying, you need trained technicians. To scale production, you need materials, standards, certification pathways. To operate independently, you need data, testing protocols, and decision-making power that doesn't depend on external signatures. And quietly, That ecosystem was already forming. Sources close to the project describe parallel programs launched months before the reveal, training modules for local engineers, partnerships with regional universities, and apprenticeships designed not just to assemble parts, but to understand design logic. That detail matters more than most people realize. Assembly can be outsourced. Understanding cannot. By embedding design knowledge locally, Burkina Faso wasn't just building an aircraft, it was building continuity, a way to ensure that the next version wouldn't need to start from zero or from abroad. This is where the story begins to unsettle established players. Because the aircraft industry has always relied on gatekeeping, certification regimes, proprietary standards, closed ecosystems where progress moves only as fast as permission allows. But this project followed a different logic. Rather than chasing global approval first, it focused on regional utility, short-haul operations, humanitarian logistics, environmental monitoring, routes ignored by major manufacturers because margins were too thin or infrastructure too weak. In other words, problems that mattered locally. And when aviation is built around local problems, it evolves differently. Fuel efficiency wasn't optimized for marketing slides, it was optimized for availability. Maintenance cycles weren't designed around dealership networks, they were designed around field repair. Even cockpit systems reflected an emphasis on clarity over complexity. This wasn't a scaled-down version of someone else's plane. It was a rethinking of what an aircraft needs to be. As whispers spread across neighboring countries, something else began to happen. Interest, not curiosity, but intent. Governments asked whether the platform could be adapted, whether components could be localized further, whether shared production could reduce costs across borders. Because once one nation breaks the ceiling, others start looking for the door. Aviation analysts noticed the shift immediately, not because of flashy performance metrics, but because of timing. The global aerospace industry is strained. Supply chains are brittle. Costs are rising. Certification delays are growing. And here was a country operating outside that pressure, building quietly, iterating quickly, and defining its own constraints. That's when the narrative began to change. This wasn't about an airplane anymore. It was about independence of trajectory. And perhaps the most overlooked element of all, the psychological one. For generations, African engineers were trained to believe their role was to operate, not originate, to maintain, not design, to adapt, not define. But standing inside that hangar, looking at an aircraft that existed because they decided it should, something irreversible shifted. Confidence without proof fades quickly. But confidence reinforced by a physical aircraft, built, tested, and operational, becomes contagious. Inside policy circles, a quiet recalculation began. If domestic aerospace capability was possible here, then long-standing development assumptions had to be re-examined. Budgets, once allocated solely for imports, were reconsidered. Education strategies shifted from consumption to creation. Even defense and disaster response planning started to include scenarios that didn't rely on external availability. And that's when the deeper implications surfaced. Aircraft programs don't exist in isolation. They pull metallurgy forward. They refine electronics manufacturing. They demand software precision, materials science, systems engineering, and logistics coordination at a level few industries require. In other words, aerospace doesn't just build planes. It forces an entire technological stack to mature. Engineers involved in the project hinted that spin-off applications were already underway, lightweight composites being repurposed, avionics knowledge migrating into unmanned systems, propulsion research informing ground transportation, and energy optimization. None of this was announced publicly. None of it needed to be. Because the real signal wasn't in press releases, it was in momentum. International observers, once dismissive, shifted tone. Questions became quieter, more technical. Requests for visits replaced public skepticism. Not to celebrate, but to understand. Because when innovation emerges outside expected centers, it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty makes incumbents uncomfortable. What makes this moment even more unusual is how little spectacle surrounded it. No viral launch video. No dramatic claims of world domination, just a methodical reveal of something that exists and continues to improve. That restraint may be the most strategic move of all. History shows that technological power doesn't announce itself loudly. It demonstrates capability once, then scales silently. And if this aircraft is allowed to mature, iterated, localized, and expanded, it won't need validation from global headlines. Its impact will show up in air routes that suddenly exist, in response times that shrink, in costs that fall, in skills that remain home instead of exporting themselves abroad. Which raises an uncomfortable question for the rest of the world. If Africa is no longer just flying aircraft, but designing the future of flight itself, who else has been underestimated? And how many other impossible ceilings are closer to breaking than anyone realizes? Because this aircraft may not be the end of the story. That chapter, still being written, doesn't follow the familiar arc of technological dominance. There's no rush to outpace legacy giants. No urgency to flood global markets. No obsession with becoming the next symbol of someone else's future. Instead, the strategy appears deliberate, almost patient. Insiders describe a phased approach. First, mastery. Then, reliability. Then, quiet expansion. Each phase designed to harden capability before visibility. Because in aerospace, failure is remembered longer than success, and the fastest way to be dismissed is to move before you're ready. So they didn't. Test flights were incremental. Systems were stressed in conditions that mirrored real operations, not ideal ones. Components were redesigned, simplified, sometimes removed entirely when they added complexity, without resilience. This wasn't innovation chasing novelty. It was innovation chasing durability. And durability is what allows ideas to survive outside the spotlight. As word continued to circulate, comparisons inevitably followed. Analysts tried to place the aircraft within existing categories: commuter plane, utility platform, experimental craft. But none fit cleanly, because it wasn't built to compete on the same metrics. It was built to solve a different equation. One where autonomy mattered more than prestige. Where adaptability mattered more than maximum range. Where ownership of knowledge mattered more than branding. That difference is subtle, but it's everything. Because global aviation wasn't designed for regions that need flexibility. It was designed for regions that already have it. This aircraft reverses that logic. It assumes constraints, and then engineers around them. That design philosophy may be its most exportable feature. Not the plane itself, but the method behind it. Already, discussions are rumored across other sectors. Could this approach apply to rail? To energy generation? To manufacturing systems long thought too complex to localize? Once the mindset shifts, the boundaries blur. And in that blur, something powerful happens. Dependency begins to loosen. This is why the reveal unsettled more than it impressed. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. And it didn't ask for approval. It simply existed. And existence, when it contradicts expectation, is the most disruptive force of all. The world may still be catching up to what happened inside that hangar in Burkina Faso. But one thing is already clear. The sky above Africa is no longer just a passageway. It's becoming a proving ground, and proving grounds have a way of attracting attention, quietly at first, then all at once. Because when something works under pressure, others begin to wonder what it could do with support. Regional airspace authorities started asking different questions. Not if the aircraft could fly, but how it could be integrated. How certification frameworks might evolve to accommodate platforms designed outside traditional pipelines. How regulations, often inherited wholesale from former systems, could be adapted rather than copied. Those conversations matter more than public applause. Because regulation decides what survives. And for the first time, the discussion wasn't about granting exceptions, it was about building new baselines. At the same time, something else was happening on the ground. Young engineers, students, and technicians began seeing the aircraft not as a distant achievement, but as a reachable one. Not something built somewhere else, but something that emerged from conditions they understood. Scarcity, improvisation, persistence. That shift in perception is hard to measure, but impossible to reverse. When people stop asking who allowed this and start asking, how is this done? Momentum forms. And momentum, unlike funding, doesn't disappear when headlines fade. There are already indications that this project won't remain isolated. Frameworks developed here, training, modular manufacturing, localized testing, are transferable. Not just within aviation, but across any industry where complexity has been used as a barrier. That's the quiet thread embedded in this story. Not the aircraft itself, but the idea that high-technology systems can emerge without inherited dominance. Once that idea takes hold, it spreads faster than any plane ever could. So while the rest of the world debates whether this moment is symbolic or substantial, something far more important is happening out of sight. Iterations continue. Skills deepen. Confidence compounds. And somewhere between the next test flight and the one after that, a line will be crossed, one that no announcement will mark, but everyone will feel. Because the moment Africa stops being surprising, it starts being expected. Expectation, once established, reshapes behavior. Funding decisions begin to look inward. Talent that once left begins to hesitate. Partnerships shift from dependency to negotiation. And that's where the ripple effects become impossible to ignore. Because aerospace is not an endpoint, it's a signal. It tells investors where competence lives. It tells institutions where risk is manageable. It tells governments where sovereignty can be strengthened without confrontation. Quietly, procurement strategies adjust. Training budgets expand. Infrastructure planning starts to assume domestic capability instead of imported solutions. None of this happens overnight, but it happens inevitably. What makes Burkina Faso's moment especially significant is timing. The global system is under strain. Energy transitions, supply chain fragmentation, geopolitical realignments. In moments like these, innovation doesn't always come from the most powerful players. It comes from the most adaptable. And adaptability thrives where necessity has been constant. The aircraft still evolving becomes less a product and more a reference point. Proof that complexity can be unraveled. That scale can begin small. That independence doesn't require isolation, only intention. And intention is what this project radiates. There are no declarations of dominance. No claims of replacing anyone. Just a steady accumulation of capability, step by step, version by version. That's how enduring systems are built. So when future historians trace the shift, when they ask where Africa's role in global innovation truly changed, they may not point to a viral announcement or a global summit. They may point to a hangar in Burkina Faso, to a plane that wasn't supposed to exist,